Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 901st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring William Villalongo and Allison Glenn. And we are thrilled to welcome poet Tongo Eisen-Martin here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of enslavement and dispossession that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. William Villalongo strategically uses imagery and material to collage a comprehensive representation of the Black identity. The artist's kaleidoscopic conversation of signs and symbols explore themes of diaspora, deep time, freedom, and transformation. In 2024, Villalongo will have a solo museum exhibition originating at the Grinnell College Museum of Art, traveling to Madison, Boulder, and Philadelphia. He is the recipient of the 2022 Rome Prize, among several other awards. Allison Glenn, our host today, is a curator and writer deeply invested in working closely with artists to develop ideas, artworks, and exhibitions that respond to and transform our understanding of the world. Glenn's curatorial work focuses on the intersection of art and publics through public art, biennial special projects, and major new commissions by a wide range of contemporary artists. Thank you all so much for joining today, and I'll turn it over to you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and the whole Brooklyn Rail team. And Will, it's so exciting to be here with you today.
It's good to see you. Good to be with you.
We were just catching up about when we first met and decided it was about a little over a decade ago.
Yeah, it's been quite a while, but you're here in New York now.
I'm here.
I'll see you more, hopefully.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, should we jump into it?
Sure. Go for it.
I think we'll wait. Perfect. There's the PowerPoint. Okay, well, I thought, a really great place to start would be your current exhibition that opens September 7th at Susan Inglet Gallery. It's titled Black Menagerie. Can you talk to us about this current exhibition?
Yeah, the exhibition really brings together a collection of imagery and that I sort of sourced and researched while I was in Rome as part of being a Rome Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Rome. I really went there, I guess, with the general idea that I would look for signs, symbols of the Black presence in antiquity. I mean, it was really a desire to kind of expand, my, American-centric point of view on the world and be immersed in a different part of the world and trying to understand what my place as someone coming from the Black Atlantic means in relationship to the Black Mediterranean and what I could find. So there, I found things new and all kinds of things new and old within that idea, but I think it was really my intention to go there and think about time in a deeper trajectory of time. And so I found myself sort of gravitating towards these objects, a lot of ancient pottery and objects, some during the Roman Empire, or some things go as far as BC, but what they have in common is that they, and I am speculating on their representations of Black figures at the time and bringing it into the work.
I love that. And I was really excited to get the email about this show and see it, because I also have been thinking a lot about the themes that your work is interrogating. Specifically for me, I've been looking at deep time, the Congo cosmogram, thinking about the idea of Drexia, outer space, and syncretic traditions, and really trying to understand through artist practices, because that's how I work, right? Through how you all work. And so how through artist practices and the themes you're all interrogating, how you're thinking about those subtly connected themes. So syncretic traditions in the Americas, and how they're really coming from African continental religious practices and traditions. And your work is very much speaking to that. What was curious to me is how this came about at the American Academy of Rome.
Yeah.
How did the residency foster and support the development of this body of work?
Well, you kind of bring yourself to a place, right? So it becomes, I think part of it is me being in that space, and what the kind of, what I'm bringing kind of changes maybe some conversations about that may be happening there, but also learning more. It's a complicated question, I think, and maybe as we talk, we'll go deeper, but that experience really put me in a place where I was around people who are really like sort of experts, right, or scholars who are really deeply researching these themes, like the classics, medievalists. People were looking at, architecture, landscape architecture, these, and in the context of this ancient sort of world. And so I am coming to it with this kind of, I come to that place with this kind of Afrocentric view already in my work. One tangible thing is that I maybe is good to know is what the initial thing that brought me there was this fountain in Piazza Navona. It's called the Fontana del Moro. And so it features a Moorish sort of Neptune figure. So it's funny that you bring up Drexia, because when I've gone to Rome previously, and it always kind of blew my mind that in the middle of Piazza Navona was this kind of perfect image of a Black Atlantis. So this kind of just, I think it has always been with me, and I think kind of, wanting to go there, I think my imagination was sparked with the question of why in the world there are Black Atlantics in the middle of Piazza Navona, and what does it mean for that place? What are the larger kind of histories around that idea? And so that really sort of sparked thing, but then you can see like it kind of plays into a lot of the imagination that I had in the work, which is, how does one talk about the Black figure, talk about the Black presence without necessarily imaging a kind of a formal portrait, right, of a figure. What is abstraction? How does abstraction play into the notion of representation? How do you get at things such as migration or time through a body? So that automatically puts me into all of these spaces that you're talking about when you're talking about the Congo cosmogram, and thinking about different points in time being interconnected, and being able to traverse time in a kind of nonlinear way. So in the work, that's kind of what you see as a kind of collision of very different timelines, both a kind of contemporary figure that is pulled in, or in the case of the image that they're showing right now, it's sort of exploding kind of trajectories of history that are all kind of happening at sort of once inside of a body. I think I'll stop there without talking too much more.
Great. No, that was fantastic. I love this idea of a collision of timelines. I wrote that down. And we're going to get into this particular work later on in our discussion. But right now I want to talk a bit about materials and things that for me seem to reference previous bodies of work. Because this body of work is a departure, but there are definitely similarities. Materially, you use incised velvet, flocked velvet that you cut often. And you use it in these kind of grand landscape paintings or had in the past, in many other ways. And so I was hoping you could talk about the use of velvet in this particular body of work, and then the reason for a shift. Maybe not with this material, but the shift in the work itself.
Yeah, maybe I guess the work that this work in a sense is a sort of has been evolving, I would think maybe since 2015 or 2015 and 2016. And I think it was a moment where I was, like you said, making these paintings that had like lots of landscape, and they had these velvety borders. And I kind of really came to the velvet itself as a material that was, say, I guess I have to kind of go back a little bit just to say that, like, the velvet material really allowed me to get out of the kind of hang-ups of a kind of Western-centric art history and materials and making, those traditions. I think in a sense at some point I felt a little bit hindered by in relationship to thinking about how to actually sort of critique that the very culture that comes from. So I went to something that was familiar, but also it served as this kind of. I started out with black velvet. Some of these other ones are colorful, but I started thinking about this as a kind of space, like a rich black space, and black being this kind of expansive term of both body, but space, as well. So, this work sort of evolved, and I use it in different iterations. But I guess in this recent iteration, I really, it really came in relationship to thinking about Michael Brown and Ferguson. And I think at that point I was making these paintings that were kind of talking about art history, and they were fun, but I kind of found myself then reflecting back on my own body, and I think that kind of kicked off this kind of shift where the materials and some of the motifs and things of looking at the floral as an expression of a body or expression of space became, all of that started to come together within a kind of black male body, right, more or less. And so, previously I had just sort of started by cutting the material and more or less forming a figure. And as it sort of evolved, I think its ways of representing a figurative form has sort of shifted maybe into a more abstract space, right, where these elements kind of are both dispersing and coming back together.
I love that. And I love the idea of surface and disbursement and abstraction. And there's also something else I noticed in your paintings. There's these undulating surfaces. So there's this kind of like fractured surface that feels quite terrestrial. They feel of the earth in that way. But I'm sure there's a reason why you made that decision to have and can you talk to us about that? Because if people haven't seen the show, they might not understand what I'm referencing.
Yeah, so and what I think you're talking about is that there is a kind of relief happening in which the planes are shifting at various levels of depth. It's not just one flat surface. And it really is, there's so many reasons. And, as an artist, it's like, there's a practical reason embedded in it, which is that when I was in Rome, I really had to work in a modular way. I had to keep things very light and small, and that became a way. But then, other things became really present being there. One was how things are built, and a lot of buildings were made in antiquity with these kind of stacked blocks, and I think that had an effect on me visually. And then it really kind of locked in when I went to see the Great Sphinx in Giza in Egypt, in which, okay, well, now this is even like 3,000 to 5,000 years before the Roman Empire, and this same kind of building technology is being utilized, but maybe even larger, unbelievably larger blocks of, full blocks of stone, seeming like they've been wet sawed, smooth, and stacked. So this kind of like stacking and this kind of shifting of planes became a way to both think about, what do I do with this kind of the practical problem of the modularity, but then tie this back to the visual culture that was sort of that I was sort of looking at and being inspired by in the work itself. Yeah.
It's such a poetic and practical way to approach making, right? It's evocative of antiquity, yet also really based in a practical practice of making, which again points back to how it's evocative of a particular kind of ancient building technology. So I love that you insert yourself in that way. That's a very tactile way to think about a non-linear time, right?
Yeah. And that's also this, like you said, terrestrial, which I never thought about that, but it as much as I think about the surface as a painter and the cutting, that has always been so visual in my mind. But it's interesting to think about it as a kind of as traversing it, sort of like on foot. I guess through your eyes, but in these shifts of planes, yeah, you have to kind of like move your eyes back and forth as you go along the surface.
Yeah, and that kind of shift in the surface it's an indicator, right? It signifies something to me as a viewer, that something is happening. I need to pay attention. It's very different than a flat canvas or series of materials collaged. And you often use collage in your work, so it's not new, but it's a very different way of thinking about depth.
Yeah, I'm glad it was. It's like I'm glad it was. Sometimes as an artist, the work kind of pushes you. The decisions you make, or the limitations that you're presented with actually become a collaborator, right? Like in the making of the work.
Yeah, that's where it lives, right? The limits are really the opportunities. And as you said, they push you. And there's also, it's interesting to hear you talk about abstraction. I think that your work has always had elements of abstraction and figuration, and thinking up and about multiple simultaneous moments in time. And what I really appreciate, would you agree, or do you want to add more to that?
No, absolutely. I think that one of the things that holds true throughout everything is trying to collapse time and kind of reverse or rearrange narratives.
Yeah. And there's this element of portraiture in the new work, though. So portraits don't have to necessarily be representational, right? We understand that very clearly. But there are a couple people that this work is paying homage to, well, many people, but there's a few that you name in titles. And the people that you're referencing are David Drake and Sasha May Eccleston. And I think at this point, we probably want to go to slide 7 so we can talk a little bit more about A Dance for Dave. And in kind of looking at this, there's the inclusion of North African slipware, seashells, butterflies, and it's meant to speak to the history of enslaved potter David Drake, who's one of the Black potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina.
Wonderful. You got me like halfway there. So yeah, I saw that work when the New York Times article came out, and I think it was just before I actually went to Rome. So this was probably 22, right? 2020 is like one of those things that happened at the top of the pandemic. This article on David Drake came out, and I thought it was really interesting and wonderful, like everybody else. But when I was in Rome, so much of the material culture that I ended up dealing with, right, is ceramics. Ceramic was sort of this it's like everyday pedestrian thing, but also this very elegant, incredible things. But so much of it is left and preserved and in museums and things like that there. So it became the places where I would see like images of, of the Black presence. And that I had to kind of really take that in a larger way, right? It wasn't necessarily like always just meaning that it was a representation of a face, right, or something naturalistic. That lives in the fact that a lot of the pottery in this piece that you're seeing was made in, say, Tunisia or Libya, and being traded and has migrated across the Mediterranean. And the one thing about that I found that was fascinating was that in the Roman Empire, there were handicraft plantations. This is something that I didn't really know. So it was very similar in that sense to Edgefield, South Carolina, which was also handicraft plantations. And then what I found even more interesting was there's a kind of history to this. So this type of pottery, right, starts in BC. And so it has this longer timeline before it starts being made in North Africa. And it starts with Atean potters and say like Tuscany, modern day Tuscany. But those timelines cross, and that pottery and those plantations start to move to North Africa, right, and become mega producers for this slipware. Is light. It was light and it was compact, and it became this kind of everyday material. But what was interesting is that Aratean pots, you can see some in the Met, they're actually signed by the makers. So all of those people would have been enslaved people. Some of those pots may have been freedmen, but during the Roman Empire, you could buy your freedom, but usually what that meant was you were starting a plantation. You went from being working a plantation and being enslaved, buying your freedom, but then most likely that exchange would be to start, to replicate. So of course the inscription drew me in and made me think of David Drake immediately, but it also just reminded me that there are these relationships between the Roman Empire and, say, U.S. slavery. Often in history, we're taught that these things have nothing to do with each other, which keeps these kind of grand narratives of the great Roman Empire and European sort of the history of that in this kind of very special place and very away from the kind of brutality of American style or U.S. style, slavery. So many of those walls in which maybe that I maybe had through education became like sort of broken down, both by seeing this stuff, by talking to archaeologists, talking to classics people and medievalists, asking them questions, challenging them. So that became where this piece really came out of. It's literally the collision of those two things and understanding that this kind of amazing practice of inscription on these pots is like sort of somehow coming back in Edgefield, South Carolina, with David Drake, with all kinds of similar things, the pots being special and being valued, and in a way that other things weren't, that were being made at the same time.
My mind is blown.
Exactly. Exactly. So I was like mind blown. Yep.
Because what I actually pulled up, what I've been looking at specifically when we talk about inscriptions and the Congo cosmogram, is that there were these marks on the underside of colonna-ware bowls, or these like earthenware vessels that were created by enslaved African Americans that were excavated from riverbeds in South Carolina. And the inscription on the bottom of them has been identified as Congo cosmograms.
Wow.
And similarly, of course, Robert Ferris Thompson and many others have traced this kind of like movement of that symbol into the Americas, and ground drawings in Cuba it's found. So this idea of the inscription on the bottom of the bowl is also quite resonant.
It's why like migration is like super fascinating to me, because like people can migrate, but ideas migrate, as well. And it becomes like, who's to say when you get into these longer trajectories of time, so many things are lost and erased, and who's to say who or what's been kind of holding these things together, but they kind of magically, maybe incredibly, kind of find themselves coming back up in different ways. What I found interesting is that we often, when we talk about like things like enslavement, we often just we're very talk about it from a U.S. perspective mostly, so almost becomes like, Black people, like in terms of, according to like the Western narrative of the world, like what we call officially Black people, right, start just magically appear somewhere in the 1450s or something like that, right? This idea of a Black person or something. And then before that, it's this notion that, there was no sort of conceptions of race or whatever, as scholars will tell you. And they make it very challenging to kind of say definitively that is like, I'm looking at this Black presence. It's interesting because it brings me to Sasha May. It brings me to the second part of your question, because she really helped me understand all that. Understand what I was looking at. And that was important, because we never account for, like, say, the sub-Saharan slave trade, right? Which goes back really much further, so there's this large, this constant migration from sub-Saharan Africa into the Mediterranean. It has been. And yet, right, like in today, today Europeans are wondering, like, well, why are these people coming here? Right? Why are they coming to Italy? Why are they, coming into France, and and it's because they always have been, like that people just have always been doing that. So we look at it as kind of a new thing, but it's very old.
I love that. And you're going to jump into Sasha, because that was my second question. But before, I just wanted to say what I'm hearing from you is like really needed in this moment of intense nationalism and the closing of borders and all of this fear around immigrants. It really gets at these kind of, I don't know, modernist ideologies of essentialized anything, of essentialism, right? Because the idea of a Black person is it's an impossibility to fix.
Right.
It's an impossible thing to actually articulate, just like anything else. And so from my vantage, the only way to possibly articulate it is through histories, traditions, language, food, like the cultural kind of anchors, which can be shared with other cultures. I don't know, I'm going a little off script, but you've just really, you've put me kind of for a loop in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a way to think about it is that there's so much more that connects us as people, even Black people, across these notions of all these things that you mentioned. There's this, in other words, skin, right, and skin tone or not, or I think are very much can very much be very kind of within a kind of an American history, wrapped in a kind of American history kind of idea of what that dynamic is. But there's much more, right? And I get, Sasha May, right? So because this it may be helpful. So Dr. Sasha May Eckelson is a John Rowe Workman Assistant Professor in Classics at Brown University. And Sasha May was also a fellow at the American Academy in Rome. This is the very kind of conversations that I would be having, right? Where I'm like looking at this pot, I'm like, wait a minute, this person's like, if you look at like one of the pieces that like Sphinx or the previous piece that with the scarabs, those Janusform pots, I mean, the portrait of a Black person on that seems so obvious to me that it's a Black person, right? But you'll have like a scholar be telling you, well, we're not quite sure, like we're not quite sure if this is like, and you kind of feel like you're losing your mind or something, right? Because it's because I'm like, wait a minute. My mama Black, my sister's Black. Like if there's anybody who knows a Black person when they see one, it should be me. But then you're like, wait a minute. And so, with Sasha May is actually asking those questions in her research, thinking about identity and relationship and to material culture, and also looking at the timelines of the Roman Empire and how that is how those histories and practices find themselves in, say, like the British Empire and post-colonial sort of lands in the US sort of imperial projects, such as like, slavery, or even current, like, Puerto Rico, its relationship to territories. So that was really helpful. And that's and that that really became this kind of conversation that we're having here, which is like, wait a minute, what are the ways that we're seeing ourselves within this larger trajectory of time? And it's a shard of pottery. It's it's a technique or a way of doing something, right, that has like lasted like for eons, that originated in a certain place, or it's right, like food traditions migrating. Think about Nduja. Nduja is like a kind of sausage, spicy thing in southern Italy. Like those the Calabrian chili and all that kind of stuff is like so connected to like the African continent but it's so much identifies as a kind of food of a particular region of Italy, like things like that. And I'm like, how do I do that? Like I'm thinking now, like, how do I get Nduja sausage into my work? Like how do I mix that? How do I mix that into a kind of trajectory of this of migration, or ways in which exchanges are happening, right, over time and space.
It's wild. I think for me, I appreciate you sharing that, and I feel like it gets to the idea that we've always been moving around on this globe, right? Like humans have always been moving around and sharing and trading and learning from each other.
Yeah. And I guess the thing that for me is it's the erasure, or the ways in which, right, that we have to deal with erasure, or the ways in which we have to deal with people telling us that we're not seeing what we obviously are seeing, and the fact that we have to sort of defend what we're seeing, defend the histories that we know to be true, even if that your gut is speculating on something, that there's something in that. There's some truth in like what you're feeling or thinking about. And so those are, my time, there was a lot of that in terms of like research. It was like actually like fighting with like scholars. I'm like, wait a minute, no, are you kidding me? But very productive in that way at the same time, I got to say.
I love that. How long were you there?
A full year.
Okay.
Yeah, a full year.
Fantastic. So you were fully there. You didn't commute back to New York?
No, not once. I was very happy about that.
Love that for you. Sounds like a dream. Okay, I think we should go to slides 4 through 6 to talk about the last kind of work I wanted you to speak about before we open up for questions was Beacon. Because, Will, I have never seen a sculpture that you've made. And this could just be me not knowing that you make sculptures, but I was quite struck by Beacon. It's this sculpture that was in the back gallery, and I was hoping you could talk us through this work.
Well, I've tried. I'll say it that way. I've done little things here. And been very shy and about that, but I've always kind of tried to make something. But yeah, I felt like this is a proper sculpture that kind of went all in. The piece, it was like one of the first things that I made there, because I couldn't, I don't use these traditional mediums, like sort of like oil paint. So like in Rome, it's like it's like so traditional. Like I could get like, the most amazing oil paint and like surf in traditional canvases and stuff like that. All the stuff that I don't use, I could get that really easily. But the things that I use to make these kind of paintings, assemblages, just weren't readily available. But what was available was objects. And I went and sourced a lot of this stuff at the Porta Portese sort of flea market. Like, so there's in the piece, there's shells, there's seashells, and there's like a little object called a testa de moro, which I'll talk about. Gold chains. Some of the gold chains I brought here in Chinatown with me thinking that I would do it. Work on there, and there are gourds in there that I found in a farm in Rimini, they had like an online shop that sold these kind of big dried gourds. People use those for like, bird feeders and kind of things like that. But so I basically wanted to was thinking about all of these themes and wanting to kind of think about myself, like coming to this other place and where could I find a kind of connection, right? And so one of the first things I learned about was one, the Testa de Moro, which is this kind of wild story. There's a close-up, if I don't know what slide it is, but yeah, that one. The Testa de Moro is it's a planter, right? It's this that you're seeing is a kind of like a little kitschy version of that. It's not even an actual, you can't put plants in it. I drilled a hole and put basil on the underside. But the story goes about the 10th century in Sicily, a Moorish prince. This is when the Moors ruled Italy. These are North African people who are ruling over Italy and the large swath of Spain. So this prince spots this Sicilian maiden on her balcony, and they kind of connect. Long story short, they fall in love, and eventually he has to leave, and he has a family, and he has a wife and he has a family at home, and she finds out about this, and then their last night of making love, after making love, she cuts off his head and she places it on her balcony and begins to plant basil inside the head. And the basil grows so beautifully that everybody wants a head of a Moor, Testa de Moro, on their balcony. So this kind of ceramic tradition starts out of this folklore of and so when you're in Sicily, first of all, basil is really huge, and then the Testa de Moro is everywhere. Like everywhere you go in Sicily, somebody's trying to sell you a Testa de Moro, like a little planter pot. Really violent, but also speaks to the Black presence in the Mediterranean and histories, deeper histories of that exchange. And then for me, the drinking gourd really speaks to an American folk song called "Follow the Drinking Gourd." So the drinking gourd is a metaphor for the Big Dipper, which was key to finding north on the Underground Railroad. So I'm kind of just sort of physicalizing the Big Dipper with these dipper gourds. And I guess the entire sculpture kind of reads as maybe like a big fish that has been kind of pulled up on these gold chains, or maybe the gold chains starts to be a kind of skeleton, a skeletal of this large fish. There's seashells, and there's the Testa de Moro and basil. There's stones like obsidian and quartz and hematite. These are said to have healing properties for deep trauma or historic traumas. And so those are all the materials, and they're flocked. The gourds and the fishtail and all of the objects are flocked with a velvet. These are like small fibers that are like, I guess, sort of adhered to the surfaces, so they're very plushy. And everything in the sculpture is like real. There's no like casting or anything. The only thing that's fake is the tail, which is kind of properly sculpted out of a foam material.
Wow. There's I actually think I have 2 Testa de Moro figurines. They were given to me by a friend who collects them to kind of pull them out of circulation in a way. And it's the head of a man and a woman, but I just looked up Testa de Moro as you were speaking, and it kind of looks like it derives from that. They're this very dark black glazed porcelain that you could put flowers in or something like that.
Yeah. And and it's interesting because it is very like, it's not quite the story of like how we think about the Mammy and Sambo, salt and pepper shaker things from the American, the US. It's not quite that, but it's something. I feel like I think as an American being in there, feels very similar. And
violence.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of violence in the story, right? But it's so amazing that being there, that they have no idea, like what they just think of it as, like this thing that's always kind of been there, you know. Funny story. So I went to Sicily to do some research. And so I found a ceramics sort of studio.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to meet with the artists. And one of the things she said was like, I don't know any Black people, and I've never really see Black people, like in a regular basis. So all of this is just my kind of imagination. So her responsibility is to sculpt make the kind of the sculpture that becomes the mother, that makes the mother mold for all of these objects that get produced, all these pots that get produced. And it's interesting because good luck taking them out of circulation, because if you go to Sicily, you have a lot of work to do.
She's working hard, as I'm hearing you say. She's working hard in her studio.
You have a lot of work to do. That is a serious tourist economy engine that I'm not sure. At the same time, they are incredibly beautiful. Like, I'm sorry, but like some of those things are just like insane. The craftsmanship gets to a place of like such insanity that you're kind of convinced a little bit. But yeah, I did not buy any for the same reasons. I couldn't support it like with my money. Besides this little kitschy one, which really is not it's just like a resin thing. I should also say, before you go to question, I kind of did a collaboration with Igor Santos, who is a composer at the Academy. And so there's a kind of sound component to the sculpture that really is an invocation of night, sounds of at dusk, water, conch calls.
I remember that. I remember it was very subtle. The sound was quite, it wasn't very pronounced. It's helpful to understand that it's meant to be like night. So this kind of.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's why I called it Beacon. I wanted it to be kind of like a invocation of night, or kind of a call to diaspora, this kind of connection across oceans.
Yeah, I love, people sometimes say, I've heard Harriet Tubman be referred to as a, oh my gosh, now I can't think of, and oh my gosh, not an astrologist. Wow, it just went through, it left my mind, but someone who looks at the stars.
Yeah. Astronomer, yeah, like, yeah. Yeah,
Thank you.
Because that is right. That is right. That is right, because that's fascinating, because you actually have to navigate, and there's a technique navigating by the stars from the ground, right? Like you have to, I mean, look it up on like what's that, like life hack, or how to do that. Google has this thing, how to do everything, like,
yeah.
And you literally, like, there's ways in which there's techniques, putting a stick in the ground and understanding how the moonlight is shifting the shadow, and like it's like kind of fascinating that was like science. So I'm always like fascinated, right, by Harriet Tubman, because I think a lot of times and in maybe recent cinema, we tend to there's this tendency towards to talk about her as in the magical Negro sort of genre of like, but she's a scientist, she's like someone who like really understands science and how to and these kind of very old navigational techniques. And yeah, so exactly, and that's exactly sort of where my mind was, in terms of thinking about that.
I love that. Thank you so much for walking through that. I feel like now is a good time for some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We do encourage your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I'm going to go to our friend GE first for the first question. Go ahead, GE, you can unmute.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, William. I've loved this work. It's so rich. Could you talk a bit the use of coded symbols in your work and how they really give the art kind of that secondary punch after we initially encountered it?
Yeah, I kind of, I guess you would call it like a sort of I guess it's a symbolic language, but I think that when images kind of come together, they start to build language, right? So I'm mining images that I think speak to migration, speak to healing, speak to transformation and time. And I can go through those things. So I look at it as a kind of kind of collection of things. Or so I'm often using like African sculpture and thinking about how those objects are pulled into a kind of marketplace, but they also hold on to a kind of right, they're religious objects and hold on to a connection to time and to notions of transformation and healing, as well as crystals and stones. But also those things are say when you talk about geologic rock, they're things that have been forming over sometimes billions of years, and under serious incredible pressure. So when I think about what it means to be Black in the world, these things become the language, even the language around describing how they come into being sounds like, right, feels like what a good metaphor for how I feel like, what that experience is. Butterflies and bees and birds, and these are things that like pollinate and migrate, and they move around, right? And so all this floral stuff that you see are almost like spores or like little seedlings or twigs. They're kind of like things that kind of float around and migrate, like pollen. And and then there's this ability to kind of transplant and grow, in some other place. So thinking about stories of migration and how of extraction or forced migration, and how much the kind of notion of the whim, or the idea of like floating a spore floating on the air, being sort of placed by this kind of this outsized force around them, and finding themselves somewhere. So all of these things for me, I'm looking for those images to kind of speak in the way that they exist in the world, relate to how I think about Black histories, erasures of Black histories, my feeling of my body in the world, walking through the world, sometimes more or less. Is that sufficient?
It's a beautiful answer, I think. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, GE, for your question. I see one here from Babs. I'm going to let you go ahead and unmute if you'd like. Otherwise, I'll just, oh, we have you here?
Yes, sorry about
No,
that.
no, no.
Thank you, William. This was wonderful. I'm sorry I was late, and so you may have answered this. My question, and in a sense, you've answered a bit of it through GE's answer to him, but the patterns that you are using throughout your compositions, your paintings, your 2D work, how did you get started doing that? What are the symbols and reasons for those particular patterns? Do you have a reason for the color, or is it just a aesthetic connector? So there are obviously different floral and plant connectors. So could you talk a little bit more about those connections and what they mean to the other images that you're using in the paintings?
Yeah, I mean, I think about them. There's like a kind of history of me and my making that you're maybe getting at, but then it's also like what they have evolved to. So maybe I'll start somewhere in the beginning, right? Like when I was in graduate school, I found myself like getting really frustrated with like work, and I started making these little landscapes, like imaginary kind of landscapes. And I remember a professor, I think Margot Margolis, like, why you got to stop making these landscape? What are you doing? You know, why are you making landscapes? Because I was like also making this work that had like much more content and much that had, you know, but then I found myself just like as a way to, I think as a way to kind of relax or to process this other secret weird work, which I was just like making these like sort of abstracted flower forms. And then in past graduate school, I kind of made a bunch of them, into kind of like drawings and started doing some with Sharpie marker. And they eventually, I think I didn't even know what that was. But the moment I started cutting velvet material, I almost kind of like left that behind a little bit. But I also, as I was cutting the material, I started seeing the same forms kind of coming up as I was trying to actually, in the early work where I was at maybe 2004 at the City Museum in Harlem, I was just trying my best to actually like render by cutting, rendering form, but in those little marks that felt more like I was doing like a wood block or something like that. I was seeing the same forms that I was like making floral forms. And I think it just sort of evolved in that way that I kind of recognized that. And then I thought about them as floral very specifically then, and I started thinking about them as decorative. And then I started thinking about the decorative and the floral as masculine. And then, they become very centered in terms of these collection of images that build a kind of body, right? Like, so I think about them as both floral. I do think about them floral as like twigs and branches and seeds and spores. So if and I think about that because I'm thinking about the body as something that is migratory, that's not fixed. So plants become this really interesting thing in how that they can uproot themselves and find themselves in different places. It's not as much as it is people moving them around. They also, have this flexibility. All of that stuff was just like ways. I was thinking about all of the ways in which those could be like a metaphor for being in a body. that has to maneuver, has to be agile, has to kind of navigate forces that are out of its control. That's so yeah. So what you're saying is actual, like, and then I think from there it's just me sort of imagining like different ways in which this form takes place, and a lot of it, my work, it's a very, I go back and forth from like super intuitive, like completely just feeling filling things out and finding form that feels good, and to actually trying to like think about content and meaning.
Well, thank you so much, Babs, for your question, and thank you, William. I'm going to turn it to my colleague Eleanor for the next question. Go ahead. Oops, sorry, muted you.
Thanks, Carolyn. And thank you so much, William and Allison, for this incredible conversation. The work is stunning. I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask about, just in thinking about the themes you've mentioned of collisions of timelines and mixing of symbols and layering of symbols and motifs. I'm curious about how or if you see your work in relation to Afrofuturism or to artists and writers like Octavia Butler, who explore these, the multiplicity of time and the future from the past.
Oh yeah. I've always, thought about, I guess in this way, I've always thought about like the notion of revision, like, or like just like fucking up like a Western narrative, like, because it dawned on me at some point that it's a lot of history, or what we take as Western history, is sort of a kind of pastiche of fact and fiction, or all out lies and erasures. So why not just kind of like, why hold so dearly to notions of fact, and why not remix the notion of remixing, and you think about like DJ culture, but I always thought about that, and I love Sun Ra, and I was introduced to like Sun Ra like when I was like in graduate school by Donna Nelson, and that kind of definitely took me on a trajectory. I was also included with a lot of wonderful artists in the exhibition called The Shadows Took Shape at the Studio Museum, that was curated by and those, I guess I would say the artists in that show, right, like were all people who I think were doing work in this vein, but had not kind of come to it as being like an Afrofuturist, right? Like I don't think like people like Wangechi Mutu are in that show, but I don't think anybody ever said they were Afrofuturists, but this is the kind of trajectory in which the work that I think we were making kind of found itself. And as people like Sun Ra and George Clinton become more popular, and Octavia Butler, these people are like kind of like almost like household names, but like I don't think like 20 years ago, it was the same kind of Afrofuturism wasn't being like sort of thrown around, and kind of like catalog conceits and things like that as much. So I think about it, but I would also say I don't like think about it too, like, I don't overthink about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eleanor. I just have a quick final question for you about the title Black Menagerie, and thinking about how there's a menagerie in terms of dispersal and sort of a lack of like maybe a sort of one central figure in a lot of at least these works, but then also kind of the violence of menagerie connotations. And I'm just curious about your choice for that word in the title.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on it. I think that, you know, a menagerie doesn't have to be always, it can be kind of a collection of kind of curiosities brought together. And I think that I'm interested in that term, and because of the ways in which I'm almost like a tourist, or kind of coming to these works not as an expert, or some of the things that are in the work not as an expert, but also like speculating on what those things are. So being very aware that I'm kind of like plucking things out of context and pulling them back into my own story or context, and kind of asserting a kind of narrative on them, which I think is in some ways abstracts them, while at the same time rescues them out of a type of illegibility, or because of historical erasure. So that idea of the menagerie, like I can't remember this painting now, it's killing me. I was hoping to have like some art historical moment and really blow you guys away, but there's a painting that I can't remember now, but I found it always amazing that it was like this kind of large collection of books and paintings, this large European painting, and there's like a kind of a parrot in the painting. That's the first time I learned about like kind of the notion of a menagerie, or that there were people that collected these kind of different curiosities and animals and things like that, and as a kind of practice. So I really thought about, so it's really just a connection to how I'm thinking about collage, but also thinking about the Black presence in the fraught space that is under when we talk about like time and antiquity and this kind of I guess uncertainty, right, in terms of what it is, or how many voices say or want to claim what it is or what it isn't.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for elaborating. Yeah, just so grateful to hear you speak to your practice and work today. And so here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Tongo Eisen-Martin, here. Originally from San Francisco, Tongo Eisen-Martin is a poet, movement worker, and educator. His latest curriculum on extrajudicial killing of Black people, We Charge Genocide Again, has been used as an educational and organizing tool throughout the country. His latest book, Heaven is All Goodbyes, was published by City Light's Pocket Poet series, and it won a California Book Award and an American Book Award. Thank you so much, Tongo, for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Much love and appreciation. These little societies wander together like hopeful drops of a virus. Citizen testaments bent on offering me a nation of breadwinners to hold me back like it's a Brinks. I wrinkle the concrete sometimes like flesh. My Martin Luther King permanence, turning away from a podium into the reeds like God is the dangerous twin. Black August to the mountaintop balcony on my bedroom floor. You know, they steal you from the earth itself and suspend you in your broken neck from their foolish euphoria, from the loyalty after their great superstition, loyalty after their agrarian reform. I return to my mother completely disrespected, For peeling the heat off of purgatory, they kill poets like me. Walk me away from my poems, never to be heard from again. In this foul industrial complex of bloodlines picked through a sport and spiritual death, or your devil at least half made, police become a pretty word. I'm reading a lynch mob shoestrings like they were tea leaves, teaching you how to write about cities. It's the 25th century in the mirror, people. Tyranny against your chump change. You're a chump to be mocked even with a gun in your car. A cubit of needlework spelled tune for the proletariat, the relapse ministry. Talented people curled up in a fetal position. Next to a diamond, dying, just another service day in the theatrics of tea house fascism. In a bouquet of surveillance cameras. In the poverty of God. New blue eyes, corpses of water, a newly piloted presidency of one big shiny corn, if you ask, animated capitalism, another non-literal voice killing his wife's freedom, the deification of hyphens, medicine bread and picture shows, great protesters in LA, guesses of our ink, drop kicking roses in the graveyard, DC mink like a stone torn in half, the pen advances, despite CIA guideposts, despite non-African past and futures, a metaphorical but not surreal day in the hornman life horn player improvising king. Like a radio prize fight featuring Shango himself, a real hand sweeps the land of racism. I return to the ground. Man, I make progress with the gun. On our mother Emmanuel, they put on music that evening. A swinging type body language for you to drink with fermented $5 bills for your body language, some applause. My past stomach line is neither a good thing nor a bad thing, like being psychic on the way to a lethal injection. It'll sit you down with Lady Day. Lady Day leading youth who surrendered their souls to Africa too soon. Polity thought floating in the cup of water, she saved me, accessing my stomach, accessing the love of the American lynch. Coast sleeves wood and avalanche to the wrist. Our mother Emmanuel, avalanche to the sharp keys, pain, or the deal you make with pain. A piano makes sense for them. Laying hands on the world gradually, addressing the bending necks on the streets of the north. Travel salient pain, repeating pain in the north. 10 trigger fingers on that piano, if harmony would have me. Putting 100 fights on every direction to offer the Lady Day, leaning on trees again, recruiting the countryside itself, saying, lay your plan on this lightning. Make your pawns a corner pocket of men. I gritted the blues itself. America may clean my dead body, but will never include me. There goes the poet. Killing without killing. Never mind this little painting of your language. May I be a meaningful lynching. A crow's passing. Good and dead. By the afternoon, I go to the railroad tracks and follow them to the station of my enemies. A cobalt-toothed man pitches pennies at my mugshot negative all over the United States. There are toddlers in Iraq. I see why everyone out here got in the big cosmic basket and why blood agreements mean a lot and why I get shot back at. I understand the psycho-spiritual refusal to write white history or take the glass freeway. White skin tattooed on my right forearm. Ricochet Sue is near where I collapsed into a rat-infested manhood. My new existence is living graffiti. In the kitchen with a lot of gun cylinders to hack up. House of God in part, no cops in part. My body brings down the Christmas. The new bullets pray over blankets made from the old bullets. Pray over the 28th hour's next beauty mark. Extrajudicial Confederate statue restoration. The waistband before the next protest poster. Hey, by the way, time is not an illusion, Your Honor. I will save your deaths for last. You're a widow, Your Honor. You're moving money again, Your Honor. It's only raining one thing. Non-white cops. And prison guard shadows reminded me of spoiled milk floating on an oil spill. Neighborhood making a lot of fuss over his demise in New Lake for a Black Panther party. Malcolm X's ballroom jacket slung over my son's shoulder, the figment of village, a new news to a new white preacher, all in an abstract painting for president. Hey, bought slavery some time, didn't it? The tacit screeches of military bolts and election Tuesday cars a cold-blooded study in leg irons, proof that some white people have actually fondled nooses, that sundown couples made their vows of love over opaque peach plastic and bold action audiences. The maker of a second is definitely my favorite law of science. Fondle news clippings and primitive Methodists, my arm changes imperialisms. Simple policing versus structural frenzies. Elementary school script versus even wider white spectrums, artless bleeding in the challenge of watching civilians think. Terrible rituals they have around the corner. They let their elders beg for public mercy. I'm gonna go ahead and sharpen these kids' heads and their L's myself and see how much gravy spills out of family crest. Modern fans of war, well, with their t-shirt poems and t-shirt guilt and Me having on the cheapest pair of shoes on the bus, I have no choice but to read the city walls for signs of my life. You know, a lot of God can happen in 3 seconds. Not much heaven, though. And here's a man before a fight, a leave me alone type character, emerging from the penniless death of a one-way street fiction. A fancy way of saying I'm gonna make it even if I have to drive backwards. All I have is chord changing 1,000 backhands, driving the street like I'm choking it, car full of nephews. There hasn't been a sun since November, and there hasn't been a street I can't choke to death. This city better back down. Hey, you see this gun on the table? There's something about staring until it all feels stable. Why wouldn't I protect everyone? All my death sleep late. My son better be quick. My daughter better shoot first, because we fall for no one. We fall for nothing. Okay, the first thing you'll feel is the heat. This lady would tell me, trying to tell me about possession. They drink life need is what I mostly hear. And most of the world leaves me alone. To breathe smog like a giant. To go to jail every once in a while. When the genocide kicks up in late May. When politicians have too easy a time. I'm gassing backwards out a one-way street. In honor of myself. And in honor of you. If you understand the nature of the world. And how long I've been just like my father. Well, hell of a resemblance says the anxiety of the neighborhood. This is a crossroads or a crossroads narrative of so much crossroads, people get in the habit of turning back. Turn back only to find themselves remembering me. But now my last words, a man before a fight, you'll feel the heat. But there's nothing to keep in mind. There's nothing to remember. Really, there's nothing to be. It's just this moment, then another, then stare, then it all becomes stable. Then the table lets go fuzzy, and Friday's an unfamiliar face peeking in the window. It's cool to panic for a second. Composure is wasted on your worst enemies. People are marked on that sidewalk. You're the only thing life-size. Everybody knows this in a wire hanger empire. When the blood stops walking, that feeling isn't father enough to be permission to fold. You better swing one more time. You know that father of yours rose from the grave and said, just give me 5 more minutes. He said, running water is a myth. It's us who are running up, down, and all alongside this water, and people don't rise from the grave. They're not lay down neither. It's us who flip all around their bodies. So beware when the people around you look like they about to jump. It might be your time. You feel the heat. And when 4 walls demand to be 4 walls and the earth outside mutes, don't panic. You know, don't try to recreate the earth outside. Don't tell jokes to yourself. Don't even talk disrespectfully to the 4 walls. Instead, unclench your fist and walk away. There might be heaven if you understand the nature of the world. All right, on y'all. Much love.
Wow. I'm speechless. Thank you, Tongo, so much. It's just total gift to hear you. And I'm so grateful, of course, to you, William and Allison, for today. It's been amazing. Thank you to everyone from Susan Inglet Gallery in their support for preparing for today. We also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. Today's conversation has been recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel and website shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading curated by Summer Browning, featuring Gian Davis and Leslie Seltzer and Christina Shan Ho. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. What an amazing dialogue. And thank you, Tongo, for reading.
Thanks,
you,
everyone. Great reading, Tongo.
Thank
Thank
you
you
all so much.
Love.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tongo.
Looking forward to
Thank you,
seeing the
Allison.
show, William.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Yes. Hey, Will.
If you're in New York, go see the show.
Congratulations.
Taking
Go
my
see
students.
everybody.